"You can't restore this cabin," Margaret Whitmore said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the cool mountain air. "HOA regulations don't allow it." The metal chain she'd wrapped across my cabin door rattled lightly in the breeze, tapping against the old pine boards like it was agreeing with her. I stood there on the gravel path, boots crunching softly under my weight, staring at the padlock she'd snapped onto a building that had been standing longer than most of the houses in her precious subdivision. The morning smelled like damp earth, pine sap, and fresh sawdust from the stack of lumber sitting in the back of my pickup. I'd driven nearly 1,200 miles to get here, towing that lumber through 2 states and over 3 mountain passes, because my grandfather once told me something about this place that had stuck in my head for years. Margaret crossed her arms like a judge delivering a final sentence. Behind her, 3 neighbors from the Willow Ridge Estates HOA stood watching with matching expressions of polite disapproval, like they'd just caught someone parking an RV in the wrong driveway. "This structure violates community standards," Margaret continued, gesturing toward the cabin with a manicured hand. The building leaned slightly to one side, its cedar siding faded gray from decades of snow and sun. The roof tin showed patches of rust, and the front porch sagged a few inches near the steps, but the frame was solid. I knew that because I'd already spent 2 days inspecting every beam and joist. It wasn't falling apart. It was waiting for someone to remember what it used to be. "You're welcome to remove it," Margaret added with a tight smile. "But restoration is not permitted." I looked past her toward the row of brand-new homes lining the ridge half a mile away. Beige siding, identical mailboxes, and freshly planted maple trees spaced exactly 20 feet apart. The kind of place where lawns were measured with rulers and porch lights were expected to match a specific shade of warm white. Margaret Whitmore ran that neighborhood like a suburban mayor. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this cabin had been here long before Willow Ridge Estates existed, long before anyone wrote a single HOA rule about roof colors or fence heights. I stepped closer to the door and ran my hand along the rough pine boards beside the frame. The wood felt cool and dry under my palm, grooves worn smooth by time. Somewhere inside those walls was the reason I'd come all this way. My grandfather used to talk about it late at night when he thought nobody was listening, usually after a long day working in his shop. He'd say the old cabin still held a piece of the past if nobody had torn it down. Something carved into the wood that proved the land had a history deeper than any development permit or zoning map. Margaret cleared her throat impatiently. "Mr. Carter, I hope you understand we take property standards very seriously here." I glanced back at her and nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make the wind feel louder through the trees. Because the funny thing about rules is they only matter if the person making them actually understands the ground they're standing on. And Margaret Whitmore had no idea that somewhere inside this cabin, hidden behind 70 years of weathered lumber and dust, was a name that would change the entire conversation. Her name, or more precisely, her family's. My name is Daniel Carter, and the first thing you should understand about me is that I do not buy property on impulse. I am the kind of man who reads every document twice and studies every survey line like it is a map to buried treasure. My father used to say land remembers who owned it long after the paperwork changes hands, and that idea stayed with me my entire life. I work as a structural engineer out of Denver, Colorado, the sort of job where you spend your days thinking about foundations, load-bearing beams, and the quiet logic of buildings that were meant to last longer than the people who built them. Most of my work involves restoring old structures across the Mountain West, barns that have been standing for 80 years, courthouses that still smell faintly of varnish and coal heat, cabins forgotten at the edge of logging roads. I have always believed old buildings deserve a second life if someone is willing to listen carefully enough to what the wood and stone are trying to say. That belief is exactly why I drove 1,200 miles to this stretch of forest in western Montana. The land itself sits on a gentle slope above a narrow valley where a creek runs clear and cold even in late summer. Pine trees crowd the hillsides, tall and straight, their needles whispering whenever the wind rolls down from the higher ridges. When I first saw the property listing online, the photograph showed little more than a crooked porch and a roofline disappearing behind overgrown brush, but the coordinates matched something I had seen before on a much older map folded inside a cardboard tube in my grandfather's attic. That map dated back to the early 1950s, drawn in pencil and ink on yellowing survey paper, and in one corner there was a small square labeled simply cabin. My grandfather, Thomas Carter, had pointed to that square one evening while the smell of motor oil and pine cleaner filled his workshop. He told me the cabin had once belonged to a family who lived in the valley long before the ski resorts and vacation homes arrived. They built it by hand using timber cut less than 200 yards away, hauling the beams with horses and shaping every board with tools that would look antique today. According to him, the builders left something behind inside those walls, a mark carved into the wood that proved who had started everything here. He never explained why it mattered so much, only that the carving should still be there if the place had not been torn apart. Years later, after he passed away, I found the old map again and began searching county records until I located the parcel where the cabin stood. The property had changed ownership several times, eventually ending up in the hands of a development company that sold off small sections to finance the neighborhood now called Willow Ridge Estates. But the cabin lot itself had never been redeveloped, perhaps because the terrain was too uneven for modern construction. I bought the land outright 6 months ago. 43 acres of forest and meadow, plus one aging cabin that most people would have bulldozed without a second thought. To me, it looked like an unfinished conversation with the past. I brought tools, lumber, and a truck full of supplies because I intended to repair the porch, replace the roof panels, and restore the structure exactly the way it had been originally built. I wanted to see that carving for myself. And now, standing in the mountain air with Margaret Whitmore and her neighbors staring at me like I had broken some invisible rule, I realized something important. They believed this land belonged to their community simply because their houses overlooked it. They believed their regulations carried more weight than the history buried in these trees. But history does not disappear just because someone writes a rulebook. Sometimes it waits quietly inside an old wall, patient as the forest around it, until the right person shows up and starts listening. Margaret Whitmore did not move the chain from the cabin door. She stood there with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years telling people what they could and could not do, and nobody around her had ever seriously challenged it. The breeze pushed a faint scent of pine resin through the clearing while the metal links tapped softly against the wood siding. Somewhere deeper in the trees a truck door slammed, and the distant hum of a lawn mower drifted up from the subdivision below. Willow Ridge Estates was less than half a mile away, but it felt like a different world. Margaret tilted her head slightly and studied the cabin again as if seeing it through the lens of a real estate listing. This structure lowers the visual standards of the community, she said carefully. We have covenants in place to prevent exactly this kind of situation. One of the neighbors behind her, a man wearing a polo shirt with the subdivision logo stitched on the chest, nodded in agreement. I recognized the logo from the large stone entrance sign at the bottom of the road. Clean landscaping, symmetrical mailboxes, identical fences. Everything measured, approved, and predictable. Margaret pulled a folded document from a leather folder tucked under her arm and tapped the page with her finger. Section 4.3, she continued. Any structure that does not conform to current architectural guidelines must either be removed or remain unchanged. Restoration is specifically prohibited without approval from the architectural committee. Her voice carried the practiced rhythm of someone who had repeated those lines many times before. I glanced at the paper briefly but did not reach for it. Instead, I looked past her again toward the row of houses along the ridge. In the afternoon sunlight, their windows reflected the mountains like polished mirrors. Fresh paint, fresh siding, fresh landscaping that probably had not been there longer than 3 or 4 years. Compared to them, the cabin must have looked like a relic from another century. In many ways it was. The wood siding had darkened to the color of weathered charcoal, and the porch railing leaned just enough to remind you that time had been passing here quietly for decades. But the structure itself was stubbornly solid, every beam locked into place the way builders used to do before power tools and pre-cut lumber changed everything. I had already crawled under the floor with a flashlight and tape measure. The foundation stones were still square. The support beams still carried the load exactly where they should. The building was not dying. It was waiting. Margaret must have noticed the way I kept studying the cabin instead of her paperwork, because she cleared her throat again. Mr. Carter, the easiest solution would be to remove the structure entirely. Many property owners choose to start fresh. New construction always benefits the neighborhood. Her tone softened slightly, as if she were offering helpful advice rather than an order. The neighbors behind her watched my face carefully, probably expecting the usual reaction. Apology, frustration, maybe a quick promise to comply. People rarely argued with an HOA president standing on their front step, holding a binder full of regulations. I slid my hands into the pockets of my work jacket and let my eyes travel slowly across the cabin wall beside the door. Beneath the faded boards, I could almost imagine the hidden layers my grandfather had described, the older planks and framing that had not seen daylight in 70 years. Somewhere behind that wall there might still be a small carving left by the original builders, a quiet mark of ownership older than any modern rulebook. Margaret shifted her weight impatiently on the gravel. "So," she said, "what exactly are you planning to do here, Mr. Carter?" I met her gaze for the first time since she started quoting the rules. The sunlight caught the polished badge on her keychain that read Willow Ridge Homeowners Association. She probably expected a defensive explanation or maybe a complaint about property rights. Instead, I simply gave her the most honest answer I could. I am planning to listen to what this place has been trying to say for the last 70 years. Margaret frowned slightly, clearly unsure what to do with a response like that. But the important thing was not the rules she carried in that folder. The important thing was that she believed those rules told the whole story, and that meant she had not yet realized the cabin was about to tell one of its own. Margaret Whitmore eventually gave up waiting for me to respond the way she expected. The polite smile on her face tightened just enough to reveal the frustration underneath. She glanced back toward the neighbors standing a few feet behind her, and I could see the silent conversation pass between them. They had all seen this situation before. Someone buys property near the subdivision, discovers the HOA rules, and eventually falls in line. That was the pattern they were used to. Margaret closed her leather folder with a crisp snap and stepped closer to the cabin door, the gravel shifting softly under her heels. "Mr. Carter," she said, her tone cooler now, "I believe you may be misunderstanding the situation. This is not a suggestion. The Homeowners Association governs this entire ridge. These regulations apply to all visible structures within the community boundary." She raised her hand and gestured broadly toward the valley below, where the rooftops of Willow Ridge Estates lined the hillside in perfect rows. Even from here I could see the identical driveways and evenly spaced trees. Every homeowner down there agreed to these standards when they purchased their property. Those standards protect everyone's investment. I followed her gesture with my eyes for a moment. The late afternoon sun was dropping behind the mountains now, stretching long shadows across the clearing. The air smelled faintly of warm pine bark and dry grass. A hawk circled slowly above the valley, riding a current of wind rising off the slopes. For a moment nobody spoke. Then Margaret turned back toward me, her patience clearly running thin. "If the structure remains in its current condition, we will issue a compliance notice," she continued. "That notice will include a daily fine until the violation is resolved. The architectural committee meets once a month, but I should warn you that restoration requests for outdated structures are almost never approved." One of the neighbors behind her shifted his weight and added quietly, "They usually just tear them down." The words hung in the air like dust after a truck passes down a dirt road. Margaret nodded once as if that settled the matter. Starting fresh is often the best choice. I let the silence stretch again while the wind rustled the branches overhead. My eyes drifted back to the cabin wall beside the door, tracing the faded grain patterns in the old boards. Beneath that weathered layer was another story waiting patiently. The original timber, the original builders, the mark my grandfather had described so many years ago. Margaret took a step toward my truck and glanced at the stack of lumber in the bed. Fresh cedar planks, roofing panels, boxes of nails and tools arranged neatly beside a folded ladder. Evidence of plans she had already decided to stop. "You clearly came prepared," she said, her voice almost sympathetic now. "But I strongly advise you not to begin any work until the committee reviews the property. Beginning unauthorized restoration could result in additional penalties." She reached into her folder again and slid a printed sheet onto the hood of my truck. The paper fluttered slightly in the breeze before settling flat against the metal. "This outlines the community standards and enforcement process." I looked down at the document without touching it. Lines of small text, section numbers, references to visual harmony and neighborhood consistency. The language was careful and professional, written by someone who understood exactly how to make rules sound permanent. Margaret followed my gaze and gave a satisfied nod. Now that you have the information, I assume you will make the responsible choice. I lifted my eyes slowly back toward the cabin wall behind her. The sun had shifted just enough that a narrow strip of light touched the boards near the doorframe, illuminating the uneven surface where decades of weather had carved thin grooves through the wood. Somewhere behind that wall was the detail my grandfather never forgot. Something carved by the hands of the people who built this place long before Willow Ridge Estates ever existed. Margaret Whitmore believed she understood the history of this ridge because she had a binder full of regulations and a committee that met once a month. But the truth about this land had been sitting quietly inside those walls for more than 70 years. And if the carving my grandfather described was still there, the next time Margaret Whitmore read a rule out loud, she might realize those rules were standing on top of a story she had never even heard. The gravel road was quiet again after Margaret Whitmore and her small audience walked back toward their polished houses along the ridge. The sound of their footsteps faded into the wind moving through the pine trees, leaving the clearing exactly the way it had been before they arrived. The chain still hung across the cabin door, the metal links catching the last slant of afternoon sunlight. I stood there for a while without moving, listening to the quiet. Out here the silence had layers to it. The low whisper of needles high in the trees. The distant rush of water from the creek in the valley. The faint ticking sound of the truck engine cooling behind me. After a few minutes, I stepped closer to the cabin wall again and ran my hand along the boards beside the doorframe. The wood felt rough and dry, every groove shaped by decades of wind, snow, and summer heat. Whoever built this place had cut the lumber by hand. You could still see the shallow marks from the original saw blades if you looked closely enough. Builders from that era did not waste effort on perfect finishes. They cared about strength and permanence. My grandfather used to admire that kind of work. He would point out small details other people never noticed. The way beams were notched together instead of nailed. The way older cabins were positioned so winter winds hit the narrow side instead of the wide face of the building. According to him, the men who built this cabin knew exactly what they were doing. I walked around the side of the structure slowly, brushing aside tall grass that had grown along the foundation stones. The rocks were still packed tightly, the way old mountain builders stacked them so frost could not easily shift the base. I crouched for a moment and looked underneath the floor again. The support beams were dark with age but solid, thick pine timbers that had carried the weight of this building for more than 70 years without complaint. Margaret Whitmore saw a problem that needed to be removed. I saw a structure that had outlasted several generations of property owners. The difference between those two perspectives said a lot about the way people treated history. I stood back up and walked toward the front porch. The wooden steps creaked lightly under my weight, but held firm. The chain across the door was locked with a bright brass padlock that had probably been purchased at a hardware store less than a week ago. New metal against old wood. Temporary authority resting on top of something far older. I leaned forward slightly and peered through the dusty window beside the door. The interior was dim, but I could still make out the outline of the stone fireplace on the far wall and the heavy beams crossing the ceiling. Dust floated through the thin beam of sunlight coming from the opposite window. Somewhere inside that quiet space was the place my grandfather had described, the section of wall where the original builders left their mark before closing everything up. He used to say that old cabins always carried a signature somewhere if you knew where to look. Not a formal signature written with ink, but something simpler. A name carved with a pocket knife. A date scratched into the grain of a beam. A reminder that real people once stood there shaping the wood with their hands. Margaret believed her printed rules could decide what happened to this building. But those rules were barely a few years old. The cabin had been standing here since the early 1950s, watching the valley change from open forest to vacation property and polished subdivisions. I stepped back down from the porch and walked to the truck, glancing once more at the paper Margaret had left on the hood. The pages fluttered slightly in the breeze, full of carefully written regulations about color palettes and roof lines. I folded the document once and set it aside on the seat. Because the truth was simple. The story Margaret Whitmore thought she controlled had started decades before Willow Ridge Estates ever appeared on a map. And if the carving my grandfather talked about was still hidden behind those walls, the next step was obvious. I would just have to open the cabin and listen carefully enough for the past to speak. The sun had dropped behind the ridge by the time the clearing finally settled into evening silence. Long shadows stretched across the grass, and the temperature began to fall the way it always does in the mountains after sunset. I walked back toward the cabin carrying a small flashlight and a tape measure. From the truck, the chain Margaret Whitmore had wrapped across the door was still there, bright and new against the darkened wood, but I was not interested in the door anymore. My grandfather had never said the carving was inside the main room. What he told me, very clearly, was that the mark had been hidden when the builders finished the wall. That meant it would not be somewhere obvious. It would be behind something. I stepped off the porch and moved along the side of the cabin where the evening light was just strong enough to show the uneven texture of the boards. Each plank had been cut from thick pine, nearly 8 inches wide, and fastened horizontally along the frame. The wood had darkened with age, but the pattern of the grain was still visible if you followed the lines carefully. My flashlight beam slid slowly across the boards while I studied the surface the way I would inspect an old bridge support or a barn beam during a restoration job. Buildings always leave clues if you know how to look for them. Tiny gaps where boards were replaced. Nail patterns that do not match the surrounding wood. Subtle shifts in color that reveal where someone once opened a wall and closed it again. About 3 feet to the right of the doorframe, I noticed the first sign that something had changed. One plank looked slightly younger than the others. Not new, but not quite as worn as the boards around it. The difference was subtle enough that most people would never notice it. But when you spend years restoring old structures, you develop an instinct for those small irregularities. I crouched down and ran my fingers along the edge of that board. The nail heads were older square-cut nails, the kind commonly used in the early 1950s, but 2 of them had been driven at a slightly different angle than the rest, as if someone had removed the board once and put it back again in a hurry. The cool evening air carried the smell of pine needles and distant wood smoke from somewhere down in the valley. I leaned closer and tapped lightly against the plank with the handle of the flashlight. The sound that came back was hollow, just enough space behind it to hide something small. My grandfather's voice echoed clearly in my memory then, the way it used to sound when he told stories in his workshop while the radio hummed quietly in the background. He always said the builders wanted their names remembered, but they also wanted the cabin to survive the winters without anyone tearing it apart out of curiosity. So they left their mark somewhere that only a careful observer would find. I reached into the toolbox I had brought from the truck and pulled out a small flat pry bar. The metal edge slid gently beneath the lower seam of the plank. I worked slowly, easing the board outward just enough to loosen the old nails without damaging the surrounding wood. The plank lifted with a quiet creak, releasing a faint scent of dry timber that had not been exposed to open air in decades. Behind it, the flashlight beam revealed a narrow section of inner framing where the original builders had once stood finishing the wall. And right there on the pale surface of the inner beam was a carving. The lines were shallow but still perfectly clear even after 70 years. 2 words cut carefully into the wood with the point of a knife. A family name. Whitmore. The beam of my flashlight rested on the carving for several seconds before I even moved. The wood inside the wall was pale compared to the dark exterior boards, protected from decades of weather and sunlight, and the letters looked almost fresh despite the years. Someone had taken their time cutting them. Each stroke of the knife was deliberate and steady, the kind of careful work you do when you want something to last. Whitmore. The name sat there quietly on the timber, like it had been waiting for someone to notice. For a moment, I simply crouched there beside the wall, listening to the evening wind slide through the pine trees while the cabin creaked softly around me. My grandfather had been right. The mark was still there exactly where the builders left it, hidden behind that outer plank like a message sealed inside the structure itself. I ran my fingers lightly across the carved letters, feeling the shallow grooves pressed into the grain. The cuts were smooth from age, but still sharp enough to read easily. Whoever carved this had wanted the name remembered. I leaned back slightly and let the flashlight beam widen. Across the beam, just below the family name, there was a smaller line scratched beneath it, thinner and less polished than the main carving. The date read 1952. That single detail shifted something in my mind immediately. I had spent the past few months studying county records while researching this land before buying it, and the name Whitmore had appeared more than once in those documents. Not Margaret Whitmore specifically, but earlier property owners from the same family line. Ranchers who once controlled much of this valley before the land was gradually sold off to developers in the 1970s and 80s. I sat there thinking about that connection for a long minute while the flashlight beam drifted slowly across the old timber. Margaret Whitmore had walked up to this cabin earlier in the afternoon speaking with absolute authority about rules, boundaries, and community standards. She had acted like the building was some inconvenient relic that should simply disappear so the neighborhood would look cleaner from the ridge. But the truth carved into this beam told a completely different story. The people who built this cabin were Whitmores. Not just owners of property nearby, but the original builders who shaped the timber and raised these walls by hand more than 70 years ago. I stood up slowly and looked across the clearing toward the distant rooftops of Willow Ridge Estates glowing faintly in the fading light. Somewhere down there Margaret Whitmore was probably sitting in a comfortable living room surrounded by polished furniture and neatly framed photographs. She likely believed her family had always belonged to that modern neighborhood overlooking the valley. But the carving in this wall suggested something else entirely. Her family history did not start with the subdivision. It started right here on this hillside inside a rough cabin built from mountain pine. The realization settled over me with quiet clarity. Margaret Whitmore thought she was protecting the identity of her community by enforcing a set of architectural rules. In reality, she was standing on land that carried her own family's name carved deep into its oldest structure. I lifted the plank carefully and set it back into place, pressing the board snugly against the frame so the carving remained hidden once again. The wall looked exactly the same as it had before, weathered and uneven, revealing nothing to anyone who walked past it casually. But now, I understood the next step in a way I had not before. The cabin was no longer just an old building waiting to be restored. It was a piece of Margaret Whitmore's own history. And the moment she saw that carving with her own eyes, every word she spoke about tearing this place down was going to sound very different. Morning arrived with a thin layer of mist drifting through the valley and the smell of damp pine needles rising from the forest floor. The mountains always felt quieter at sunrise, as if the entire ridge was still deciding whether to wake up or keep dreaming for another hour. I stood beside the cabin wall again with a mug of black coffee warming my hands and watched the sunlight slowly reach the clearing. The board I had removed the night before was back in place exactly where it had been for 70 years, hiding the carving behind it like a sealed envelope waiting to be opened. Down in the valley, the rooftops of Willow Ridge Estates were beginning to glow in the early light. Neat rows of modern houses sitting on land that once belonged to a very different version of this place. I finished the coffee, set the empty mug on the tailgate of the truck, and looked once more at the document Margaret Whitmore had left on the hood the previous afternoon. Community standards, architectural guidelines, enforcement procedures. The language was written with the calm certainty of people who believed the present moment defined everything that mattered. But the carving inside that wall had reminded me that the present was only the latest layer on a much older story. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket before climbing into the truck. The drive down to the subdivision took less than 3 minutes. A narrow gravel road wound through the trees before opening suddenly onto wide paved streets bordered by fresh lawns and decorative stone mailboxes. Willow Ridge Estates looked exactly the way Margaret had described it. Clean lines, matching fences, evenly spaced trees planted with precise landscaping symmetry. Every house seemed designed to mirror the next one just closely enough to create the impression of order. I parked along the curb near the community clubhouse where a wooden sign announced the next monthly HOA meeting scheduled for that evening at 6 o'clock. The timing could not have been better. A few residents were already walking dogs or collecting morning newspapers from their driveways, and several of them glanced curiously at the unfamiliar truck. It did not take long for word to travel through a neighborhood like this. By the time the meeting started later that evening, the small conference room inside the clubhouse was nearly full. Margaret Whitmore stood at the front beside a long table covered with folders and printed reports. She looked exactly as composed as she had the day before, dressed neatly and holding the same leather binder that contained the community regulations. When she saw me step through the doorway, the polite expression on her face stiffened slightly, but she recovered quickly and motioned toward an empty chair near the back. The meeting moved through routine topics first. Landscaping updates, parking reminders, a discussion about mailbox paint colors that lasted nearly 10 minutes. Finally, Margaret opened a new section in her binder and cleared her throat. She spoke calmly as she addressed the room. A property owner had purchased a cabin near the northern ridge that did not comply with the visual standards of the community. Restoration work had been observed on site. The architectural committee would need to review possible enforcement actions. Several residents nodded quietly, as if the conclusion was already obvious. I waited until she finished speaking before standing up slowly from the chair. The room fell silent in that polite suburban way where people expect a brief apology before things move on. Instead, I reached into my jacket pocket and unfolded the small photograph I had taken that morning inside the cabin wall. The image showed the pale wooden beam clearly, along with the carved name and date that had been hidden for decades. I walked to the front of the room and placed the photograph on the table in front of Margaret Whitmore. Then I stepped back and watched her eyes settle on the carving her own family had left behind in the wood. Margaret Whitmore did not touch the photograph at first. She simply looked down at it, the confident posture she carried into the meeting slowly losing its certainty. The room had gone completely quiet. A moment earlier, the residents of Willow Ridge Estates had been nodding along with her explanation about community standards and architectural guidelines. Now, every pair of eyes in the room followed Margaret's gaze as it rested on the image of the old beam inside the cabin wall. The carved letters were clear, even in the photograph. Whitmore, 1952. The date sat just beneath the name like a quiet reminder of how long that cabin had been standing on the hillside above the valley. Margaret's fingers finally moved toward the paper, and she lifted the photograph slightly closer to the light. For a second, the confident tone she had used all evening disappeared completely. One of the board members leaned forward to look at the image more closely, and then glanced back at her with a puzzled expression. I could almost hear the questions forming in the room even before anyone spoke them out loud. The silence stretched long enough that Margaret eventually cleared her throat and placed the photograph back on the table. The sound was small, but it carried across the entire room. I stepped a little closer to the table and spoke calmly, the same way I would explain structural details to a client standing inside a restoration site. I told them about the plank beside the cabin door that had been replaced decades ago, and about the hollow sound behind it that revealed the hidden beam. I described the carving exactly the way it appeared inside the wall. The family name cut carefully into the wood, and the year placed beneath it. 1952. The year that cabin was first built on the ridge. Several residents shifted in their chairs as they listened. Margaret's eyes returned to the photograph again. Her voice when she spoke next was noticeably quieter than it had been earlier. She asked where I had found the carving. I explained that it had been hidden behind the outer wall board since the cabin was first completed. The original builders had left their name inside the structure before closing the wall, a small mark meant to last longer than any paint or siding. One of the older residents near the back of the room suddenly nodded with recognition. He said the Whitmore family used to own most of the valley decades ago before the land was gradually sold to developers. The connection settled across the room like a slow realization spreading through a crowd. Margaret Whitmore had been speaking all evening about protecting the character of the neighborhood and removing a structure that did not fit the community's modern appearance. Yet the building she wanted removed carried the name of her own family carved into its original frame. The cabin was not an eyesore left behind by careless owners. It was the oldest surviving structure connected to the very people whose name she carried. Margaret studied the photograph one more time before finally letting out a quiet breath. The room waited while she gathered her thoughts. When she looked back up at the group, her expression had changed in a way that was difficult to miss. The certainty was gone, replaced by something closer to reflection. She closed the binder containing the enforcement documents and rested her hand on top of it. Then she spoke slowly, acknowledging that the cabin represented a piece of the valley's history that deserved to be preserved rather than erased. The architectural committee would withdraw the compliance notice and allow restoration work to proceed as long as the original structure remained intact. A few people in the room nodded quietly in agreement. The meeting moved on to other topics soon afterward, but the conversation in the hallway afterward was very different from the one that had filled the room earlier that evening. By the time I drove back up the gravel road to the cabin, the night air had grown cool again, and the stars were beginning to appear above the ridge. The old structure stood exactly where it had always stood, quiet among the pine trees, carrying the mark left behind by the hands that built it. Sometimes the loudest arguments are settled not by shouting or threats, but by something much simpler. A name carved into a beam, waiting patiently for the right moment to be seen.